Kia ora tātou, welcome to this discussion hosted by the New Zealand Food Safety Science and Research Centre on a subject that involves practically everything really, personal health and finances, the economy, the environment in New Zealand, food. Increasingly urgent considerations about all the above have made it occurred to me, being a waiter on a very complicated business, so many questions, right? Is it organic? Where's it from? Is it free range, lactose, gluten-free, animal, protein-free, nut-free? Will it taste good? Oh, and is it safe? Consumers are getting picky. And in our export markets, crucially, it seems we can no longer rely on an endless global appetite for meat and dairy. So what will people want, and how will New Zealand sell it to them? Our panel will take an informed look at the future of food and what it means for us. With us here in Hamilton is Professor Caroline Saunders of Lincoln University. His specialty is overseas consumer patterns. Dr. Miranda Mirosa, Senior Lecturer in Consumer Food Science at the University of Otago. She's very interested in food waste. We've just been talking about that. Professor Martin Cole, Deputy Director for Ag and Food at the CSIRO in Australia, an internationally recognised food scientist, and Ray McVinnie, chef, food writer and consultant. Let me put this to the panel. The food of the future cannot possibly be meat, or at least farmed meat. It's wasteful, it's unsustainable, it's cruel, it's disease-prone, it gets stuck in your teeth and it makes your feces smell bad. Not mine, of course. Is this not sense, Martin?
Well, you know, we already have, not long ago, we're actually consuming more protein from aquaculture than we are beef. That's a few years ago. There's a big increase in other sources of protein that are sustainable. Plant protein is a particular focus.
Is this because it's recognised that growing meat is a very inefficient way to grow food?
There is an argument around sustainability, but having said that, there's parts of the world where keeping livestock is absolutely fundamental to
Yeah. But we're not talking about subsistence economies, right? We're talking about industrial farming.
Well, there are parts of Queensland that actually are very difficult to get productivity off of that land other than livestock. So it's not just in the developing world. And then the other thing is, Ray, could you imagine doing a food write-up without having meat in that column? I mean, can you imagine, you know, not having... So I think...
Well, yes, I can. It would be the angle, you know.
That would be
the angle, yeah.
It's just a habit, though, right?
Yes, it is. Food is culturally determined. Your meal times are culturally determined. They're not innate. You learn them. You learn all that stuff. You learn what to eat, and you only eat what you've been brought up with generally.
So does it horrify you guys to think that we face a future without meat? And I say real meat. We'll talk about synthetic meat, but real meat.
No.
No.
No,
Oh,
it doesn't.
plant-based diet.
I think it's look. Let's just get into this. I think it's a great thing for New Zealand because we can sell the real thing. You know, and rich people will always want the real thing. So we should be going for it. And we shouldn't be doing those brave little country speeches about being left behind and all the rest of it. Don't worry about it. You know, if you want to stand out, you've got to be different. We've got to be the fantastic, possibly organic, little farm down at the bottom of the South Pacific that doesn't try and feed the world. It just makes money.
I'm sorry, but isn't that what they said when synthetic carpets came in? All the wool farmers said, oh no, we're going to sell them the real thing. They're going to have woolly carpets and they'll pay lots of money for them.
Not marketed well enough.
Huh?
Not marketed well enough.
Well, they kept on trying, Ray. What's to say that anybody's going to be any better at marketing your real meat?
You can't eat carpet. I rest my case.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, consumers' values are increasingly tied into what they're eating and the food choices they're making, and I think those, especially for millennials, I think, you know, those values are clashing with our traditional farming methods, the way we're farming and what we're farming. And
I mean, the number of vegetarians.
The
number of vegetarians has swelled. Well, what, 27%?
Oh, the plant-based diet is absolutely becoming more aspirational in you know, some of our key export markets.
Complete.
And I think
plant-based, do you think, Miranda, or
alternative
a lot of
protein,
less,
ethically
lot less
sourced
meat.
protein.
Yeah.
All of the above.
Aspirational. What does that mean?
Aspirational. It's, yeah.
Aspirational. Look, our traditional diet was meat. It was an aspirational diet from the agricultural labourers that immigrated to New Zealand. They'd seen rich people eat. The only time they'd ever seen rich people eat was at the local market day in a provincial English town, and the rich farmers would eat what was called the farmer's ordinary, which was a big roast of meat of some sort, lots of root vegetables and a heavy pudding. What's it sound like? A roast dinner. So when they got here, of course, what did they want to eat? Meat. You didn't eat fish because that's what poor people ate.
Right, so it's a status thing.
Yeah, aspirational. There's a lot of...
It's what you want to do.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I mean, you're seeing the sports, sports people, there's an increasing number of sports people that are going vegan. I guess nutritionists are coming out and promoting less meat as part of a nutritious diet.
What do you think, Caroline? Is it a fad? Is it a fad?
Oh, I think there'll always be a case for vegans and vegetarians, but there's also big market segments wanting pasture-raised beef that are willing to pay premiums for that, and those segments are high-value segments, as you've said, Ray, and you see that particularly in the States, but other countries where they still want the real deal. And I agree with guys that say, get rid of your factory farming, stop that, but get the real deal from countries like New Zealand or Queensland.
And we grow grass here, so we can feed the herbivores. So we'll have really good grass, and we can completely subvert and ignore the American propaganda about how meat's got to be marbled with fat, which is just, doesn't make sense. You've got to feed it corn, which is really feeding it oil.
Oh, so they say that because they want to sell their...
They have feedlots that can't grow grass like we can. Yeah.
All right, let's talk about synthetic meat. It seems to be underway. There's an awful lot of money being put into the researching of it. I'm not sure who would eat it. In my brief and unscientific surveys, nobody I know wants to eat it. If they're vegetarians, why would they want to eat something that imitates meat? If they're meat eaters, they might eat synthetic. It might be the sort of the vaping of the smoking world.
Or you have no choice. You have no choice if you want to eat meat because you're poor. Rich people will eat meat.
So do you think that it will become, Martin, cheap as chips in the future, synthetic meat?
It's a million miles away from that, and I'm still struggling to see how it scales because you've still got all the inputs. I mean, you've still got to, even if you're growing fish cells in the lab or meat cells in the lab, you've still got to give it the substrate. So I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot of interest in plant, more sustainable proteins. These synthetic meats, synthetic milks. There's certainly a lot of money being invested into it. It's still off of a small base. But I don't know whether it might be a fad and there's a novelty thing. I had the Impossible Burger in Seattle recently. There were people queuing out the door. I forget how much it was, but it was a lot of money. But I don't know whether that's just a novelty factor. And I'm with you, Kim. I don't know why vegans would want to eat a hamburger that looks like a real hamburger.
But especially when they hear what's in it. This is what's in the Impossible Burger. Water, textured wheat protein, coconut oil, denatured coconut oil, potato protein, natural flavors, leg hemoglobin from soy, yeast extract, salt, soy protein isolate, konjac gum, xanthan gum, vitamins and zinc. And this soy leg hemoglobin is a vat-grown, genetically engineered form of the heme-iron found in the root nodules of soybean plants. I mean, it all sounds vile. You know, why on earth would you go to all that trouble to imitate something badly? Well, is it a bad imitation?
I didn't think it was anything like a burger, to be honest. I mean, I think it tasted okay, but there was still a massive difference between eating a real hamburger in terms of the mouthfeel, texture, and all the rest of it. So I think the question is, is it a fad? Is it going to go away? I mean, there's certainly a lot of money being invested into it. Both, there's the finless fish as well. Have you seen that one? So that's, kind of cultured fish. So you can make, fish fillets. Eventually, it's the very small scale. But again, that's coming. So, but it's a question of whether it's going to be a fad. And
isn't that meat just an extrapolation of the processed food industry? Reaching its sort of zenith. All those things that they discovered after the Second World War about preserving food. All those things you mentioned that were in that thing. If I saw that in yogurt or whatever, I'd be avoiding it. I'd be putting it back on the shelf. I don't want to eat that stuff. I just want to eat food. Actually.
Yeah, that's right. It's an extension of the whole TV dinner instant pudding thing, isn't it? The thing is, maybe synthetic meat and synthetic milk, but specifically synthetic meat, is a reasonable answer to the problem of how we're going to feed billions of people by the year 2050. We can't do it with real meat because that's too inefficient. If we grow the right crops and feed them into the machines, we'll get synthetic meat and it'll be nice and nutritious. Is there a problem with that?
Well, let's just unpack, just spend a couple of minutes and just unpack the global food security issue then. So in my lifetime, we've doubled the amount of food available to us.
But we've reached the peak now. We've reached peak food using...
It's been at a big cost to the planet.
Superphosphates, nitrogen.
It's been at a big cost to the planet. This time round, we've got to kind of do that again, but this time we've got to halve the environmental footprint. Yeah. So, but I don't think it's about, one answer. I don't think it's about getting rid of meat or anything. It's probably rebalancing diets. It's actually designing the diets that are kind to the planet and kind to us in terms of health. And also, you think about, we waste, a third of the food that we make. So we've got to have a whole of value chain approach.
So Miranda could round up all the wasted food that she's worried about, and she could pop it into the synthetic meat machine.
Half of the food would feed the world. Yeah, the food that's wasted.
That's shocking. Yeah. I mean, in terms of the future of food, how do we see that? What's going to happen? How do you stop it? Is it a matter of food needs to get more expensive so that people will value it more?
It's a lot of the solutions are really simple. I guess in developed nations like New Zealand, a lot of the food that's wasted is actually the consumer and sort of retail end of the supply chain. So the hard work is convincing a whole lot of people to make small changes.
Are you talking about the household?
At the household level,
right?
Yeah.
Well, you know why that
but
is.
But it's not rocket science.
But you know why it is, right? It's because
food is cheap. Yeah.
It's not that cheap. It's that people used to go shopping to the market every day. And now, if they're lucky, they bust a gut to get there once a week because they're too busy with the kids and the work and the dog. And the things sit in the fridge and they go old and then they get thrown out.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was a scientific
Good
analysis.
intentions no, we're busy. Yeah, life's busy.
So how are you going to fix that?
Like I said, some of the solutions are really simple. So there's been the Love Food Hate Waste campaign's been running for 3 years in New Zealand, and they've got a website, and there's been a whole lot of very simple tips that have been put onto the website. Really simple things: keeping a shopping list, making a meal plan, being prepared. These sorts of things. Good rotational management of the fridge, eating leftovers, cooking the right portions. Really simple solutions.
Are you saying that if we could crack the waste food problem, we wouldn't have a problem of feeding gazillions of people by the year 2050?
Yeah, so the Food and Agriculture Organisation estimate that if we just recovered half of what is currently being wasted, like you mentioned, Martin, 1/3 of all food that is produced on the planet is not eaten. So if we could recover just half of that, we would. We do. We have enough food to feed every person.
Especially
we have
if
1 in 9
we eat
people.
what we should be eating.
Yet 1 in 9 people, are hungry, and the resource.
Better distribution of food, do you think?
Yes, absolutely, as well. Yeah, absolutely.
It's a peculiar thing, isn't it? Because while we're talking about this, I'm still absolutely fixated on people not being able to eat meat anymore. And that just proves it, because I bet you that meat doesn't get wasted.
It does.
Does
and
it?
one of the reasons it does is linked to food safety. So we've seen as people's sort of food safety concerns are heightened, then they, if in doubt, chuck it out. I mean, that's what we've been told. And I think people have lost the ability to smell and to see. And
do you know what?
Sedate labelling is,
this
part
is
of the story.
Absolutely, by the way, but I've just been reading an article about the Faroe Islands and what they eat in the Faroe Islands. And they would hang a lump of sheep in a hut with lots of holes in it for aeration, and they'd leave it for months, and then they get it down when it's all green, and then they eat it. And it tastes, I think the description was, it tasted like a mix of pâté and death. But hey, do you think we've gone overboard on the food safety thing? What do you think, Caroline? Are we wasting food because we're too conscious of safety?
I think you've got to be careful there, because food safety is one of the most key things. You've got to watch that, and particularly with the New Zealand reputation in that space.
Yes, I do realise what the forum of this debate is as well.
Yeah.
Sorry, guys.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So watch that one. But yeah, there is probably, on certain foods, the best buy date as opposed to must eat by date. So, I think we could be a little bit more lax on that, but I think we've got to...
Yeah, and there's a lot of consumer confusion over those dates, and that's part of the problem, is the best by date is interpreted to be a use by date, and it's not, and people don't know that. And so
isn't that use by date thing a construct of the industrialised food scene, though, isn't it? Look, I cannot remember my grandmother ever having a conversation like this, because she knew how to cook. And so, of course, she knew when things weren't right, were right, whatever, what to do with them, how to save them, how to use them up. Teach people to cook.
Let me address a couple.
Utopia.
Let me address a couple of statements
Silver
made
bullet.
by the outgoing chief scientist for the Prime Minister's Peter Gluckman. GM technology is completely safe, he says. There's no significant health or ecological danger from it. It's time to reopen the debate. It may be needed for pest control, he says, and also specifically greenhouse gas reductions. Now, where does GM play in the future of food in New Zealand? Caroline?
Well, I think there's two issues there. And one is, he's right, get the GM debate up, because the technology's moved on, and you've got CRISPR and gene editing, that you can't tell the difference. So in New Zealand, that's still a GMO to get that through, whereas in Europe, they're beginning to take that out of the GMO legislation. So you could have gene editing, which is basically fast-tracking your normal breeding program.
You mean that it's not taking a gene from a different species, it's simply editing the existing genes?
Yeah.
And do you have any insight into whether the public would accept that?
Yeah, I think because you can't test for it, so that you could, that would get over the boundary on public acceptance.
Well, no, because the public would say that something's been smuggled in.
I think that's no different than a traditional breeding program. It's just fast-tracking it.
All right.
It's not like bringing foreign DNA into DNA structure, which I still think there's resistance. And funnily enough, some of the greatest resistance to that is in the US, where GMOs are, there's a lot of voice about GM-free, particularly in the premium segments. Less so in some of the European markets, and it's mixed in Asia.
So it does seem, from what you were saying earlier, Martin, that the United States has enabled the two to coexist. You have GM and you have GM-free, which whole food stocks, and never the twain meet, and everybody's happy with that. Is that an
Well, look, I
acceptable
think
compromise?
I think from as a risk assessor and someone who's worked in the food safety area, I think the science of the question of whether GM is safe or not is fairly well, from a scientific standpoint, is fairly well globally accepted. There's lots of other issues around GM. I think one of the issues for the industry introducing GM, the first examples of GM, there wasn't really this benefit side for the consumer. It was about improving yield or whatever. I think as we see new applications come through that are introducing either a really big argument on sustainability, so health of the planet, or nutrition, the health of us, then that's going to start to, people are going to weigh up then, hang on a minute, if we're saving the wild tuna population versus, they're going to be weighing up then.
That's sounded, because you talked to me about that before, but suddenly the tuna population makes no sense unless you explain it.
One of the examples is fish oil. I mean, everybody eats fish because it's healthy and it's a well-proven bioactive, despite our argument earlier on. It's very well-proven bioactive, but there's only one source of fish oil.
Omega-3, right?
Omega-3.
Okay.
So fish oil, there's only one source. It comes from marine algae. The fish eat the algae, we eat the fish. So, there's a big take-off in aquaculture, but one of the issues there is that you're still kind of having to feed fish meal to aquaculture. So one of the projects we've been working on, and we've just gone through deregulation in Australia, is to put the genes for making fish oil into a land-based crop. So we've now put it into canola, and that's being commercialised and scaled up. So you've now got a narrative, and you've got a clear you've got still a GM, but you've now got a clear narrative. You've got a health component, and also you've got a big, sustainability argument around that. I don't think we've had those sorts of arguments in the past with GM. That's the sort of narrative that may well change the things with GM. So that's, for New Zealand, I think that's the sort of technology, that you ought to be looking at. I'd also take your point, Ray, maybe GM-free, organic, the differentiated space, real meat, and etc. Maybe that's the position.
Well, it doesn't. We were talking before. Isn't this about New Zealand making up its mind what it wants to be, really?
So you think it's important to keep it as a brand? GM-free?
Not necessarily, because it's not. We're not talking about it like we used to talk about it.
Right. So
the
that's
technology
not a
has
meaningful
moved
thing
on.
anymore.
Yeah,
Well, it's meaningful if we say it's meaningful.
that's true.
It's all perception, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's still a big market of consumers in our export, that for whom it is important.
But we need to make up our minds.
But we're not doing that now, are we? We're not trumpeting the fact that our produce is GM-free.
No, we don't seem to.
Yeah, well, we have had some market access issues where we've had cheese turned back from countries because there's GM in the food safety people told me in the manufacture. So there has been resistance to product. So we're not positioning it per se in a lot of marketplaces, but some. And also it's what GM technologies are out there which would benefit either New Zealand consumers or New Zealand producers. And that's where there isn't many yet. There's a lot of talk about ryegrass that will reduce methane emissions, but it's not. I think we can sit on the fence a bit longer as well.
And as you say, Caroline, I think with gene editing now, if you're not introducing new DNA into the genome, there's an argument in other parts of the world. I know we're looking at it in Australia with faisans as well, and so I think there's a whole raft of technologies there with a whole spectrum of things, from GM, gene silencing, gene editing, that I think really need to be looked at in terms of what they can deliver for the future.
If we don't do it, Martin, what will we miss out on?
Well, you may miss out on. You may not be competitive from a productivity standpoint. Is the first
I don't think
thing.
we want to be competitive from a productivity standpoint.
No, you mean quantity.
Part of that
Yeah,
high value.
quality, high value, not low cost. So we don't want to compete with the Brazils or the US or even some of the Australian sectors because we're too small. It'd be crazy to compete in that way.
We should make it an advantage. Anything
So
that says made in France, I'll buy it.
On that basis, then you've got to be able to command a premium price. Based on the other claims that you make.
And we are doing GM, there is lots of GM work going on from New Zealand, but the big question is the field trials happen overseas, not in New Zealand, as they're looking at products and developing products and seeing what could potentially benefit us.
Yep. What do you think, Miranda?
No, I agree wholeheartedly. I think quality over quantity, and I do think it can be a valuable part of a story to a large group of consumers.
Well,
that do
that's what it
care.
comes down to, isn't it? I mean, we're a tiny player. You have to have a story, and if the story is GM-free or GE-free, gene editing free, or organic, does organic matter now?
Yeah, organic does matter because thinking about trends, the big trend at the moment is provenance. And whether you think organic foods are more nutritious is kind of irrelevant. You just know someone hasn't put things on it that you don't want there on the food.
And the animal was happy.
Well,
I mean,
so they say.
Well, that's right. The other thing that Peter Gluckman said was that in 20 to 25 years' time, this seemed like a bold claim, but he was the chief scientist for a long time. Nobody's going to be drinking real milk. It's all going to be synthetic.
Some people will.
No, everyone. That's
No,
what
we're
he
going to
said.
be selling really good milk to rich people, aren't we? Yeah.
But,
Wouldn't that be a good idea?
but what's good about our milk, I mean, we're talking about bulk production of a homogenized product.
One would
That's
hope.
not a niche market,
Over
is
to
it?
you, Caroline.
No, I would hope by then we wouldn't be doing, because it's, my dream, not an ounce of product leaves New Zealand at a commodity price, and we're not producing bulk milk powder for somebody else to that, but, specialist cheeses, specialist infant formula, up the value chain in your high-value nutrition stuff, but also in terms of how we position it in market.
It's the way you think about it. I mean, do we, as I said before, do we produce butterfat or do we produce cream?
Yeah.
You've got to make farmers into foodies. You can go to Italy and talk to people who raise animals and make things, and they might not cook it themselves, but they know how it should be cooked.
Are we getting there, you think? I mean, I've heard a lot of people, one of your colleagues, Lorraine Jacobs, actually is saying we need a culinary network in New Zealand. We need culinary tourism, and that's going to make people proud of their terroir and their regional food, and that's going to feed into the export markets, and it's all going to make us all rich and terribly happy.
Yeah, I think you've got to be careful of snotty pretension, but I do think that we've kind of almost got that now. People are very proud of the food.
I mean, in
here.
Australia, it's the same issue. It's a small, very large tail to the food industry. A lot of small players. We've got to try and get we've got to try and help those small players become bigger players.
But you've got a food board in Australia, haven't you?
We've got a national food strategy, and we've got an industry growth centre. But it's really, how do you get that information to small to medium-sized companies? There are some signs, though, that we're starting to have there's a value-adding piece coming through. I think in the last 3 years we grew food and agribusiness exports by nearly $7.5 billion. But the interesting thing was, for the first time, the majority of that, 60% of that, was in premium or value-added products. So small proportion still, in terms of, it was just that growth piece, which is still a small proportion compared to the other exports, but a sign that we're now starting. I mean, I think, Caroline, you're right. We've got to be capturing much more of that value onshore. I think it's what the markets want too. They want to know it's been, produced in New Zealand or Australia. That is meaningful in terms of food safety.
Value
in terms
added.
of
I'm
provenance.
God, how many years have we been hearing about how we have to add value?
Well, I think you've got to
products.
change the difference between adding value and changing the product. But what's happening is that we're very good at supply chains in New Zealand. We're very good at landing a product at the right quality specs and that kind of thing. But we're not very good at value chains. In fact, we're appalling at them.
What does that mean?
So that means looking at the consumer, what the consumer wants in market. I could put Zespri up as an exemplar. They change the fruit, they change it because that's what the market wants. They capture the premium, and they make sure that premium's cascaded back down to the producers. And we were talking about Mark Barton earlier on. So, there are exemplars in New Zealand, but our big industries don't do that. They think they're logistics companies or they're in another space and not really thinking how we can capture that consumer value. And we know it's in market, and we know other people collect it on our behalf. It's just making sure we capture that and it comes back. Australia's getting really good at it. So you look in the meat market, you're seeing some really good exemplars from Australia. And you're seeing some begin, as you say, those medium-sized firms in New Zealand, but it's a change of culture. Big change of culture from homogenous food production, mass production in New Zealand. Can anybody tell me the difference between Colby, mild, and Edam cheese
No
in New
difference
Zealand?
whatsoever.
I mean, they're just all
The
revolting.
tasty. Throw the tasty in there as well.
Yeah,
No taste and that tasty.
Yeah.
I know.
yeah.
But, it's all right for grating and putting in the mashed potatoes.
No, it's not.
Oh,
Yeah. I mean, I remember coming to New Zealand 20 years ago from Newcastle, which is Tyne and West, the Coles are. And I went into a supermarket and looked for the cheeses, and I went, what the hell's this? Are there any other cheeses? They sent me to a tiny little area in the shop, and I picked up a cheese, and it was from Tyne and Wear in Newcastle. I mean, isn't that amazing? You know.
However, this is not the case now.
No,
there are
it's got a
many,
lot
many
better.
New Zealand cheeses
But
that are made.
more.
More.
Look at the value. Look at where the market is. You
And
know,
say
and you
they're
think
from-
it's
Tell
just
us
cheeses,
stories.
they're not
Yeah,
good.
say they're from New Zealand. I mean, Brie and
Salad,
Camembert, it's utterly ridiculous. The only reason they've got different names in France is because they're from different places.
They are exactly the
Yeah.
same,
Yeah.
right? I knew it. I knew there was no difference between
Well,
Brie
there
and
is in
Camembert.
France. You know, up in the north where they make
Wow,
Camembert,
wow,
you know,
wow,
big
wow.
fat cows that eat grass. And
I can't help
Yeah.
thinking, I still want to get back to cutting out the middleman, you know, cutting out the grass that's eaten by the cow and then we eat the cow. Just don't eat the cow. Don't eat the fish. What you were saying about aquaculture, right? We need to eat fish for the omega-3, which is terribly good for you, Martin.
It is.
So
You're listening.
So don't farm the fish. Just go and get the omega-3 that you're going to feed to the fish in the fish pulp and make it for people. It's like Soylent, right? We were talking about Soylent before. Tell them about Soylent.
Soylent, it's a meal replacement product. It's in a bottle. I think it's made from algae oil. I think the company launched in the States a couple of years ago, 2014, and
It was
for
some
people
Silicon
that are-
Valley nerd
Yeah.
that couldn't bear to get away from his machine long enough to have a bite to eat. So he invented this thing called Soylent. And you just drink it. It's a perfect meal, right?
It's for people that are too bothered to be busy to eat, and it's it's as close as to the food pill as the food pill dream as we've ever got.
Ray
I think.
started shaking here next to
Oh.
me as a foodie, as a fellow foodie.
well, I mean, the thing is that anyone ever see that movie from the 70s, Soylent Green?
Yeah.
We know what that was all about.
Yeah.
Food for poor people.
I
Made
don't
from
know
human
why he called
effluent
it that,
for
'cause
those
it's
of you
got
that
nothing
haven't
to do with
seen the
that.
film.
But the thing about food is that you've got to understand it's food, and food is not just about eating. It's a huge culturally complex thing. So you can't just suddenly start saying, no, if you eat insects, they're very good for you and they're very cheap, you should eat them, because people won't do it. Food is culturally determined about what you like to eat, how you eat it, all sorts of things.
It's part of
Whether
our
you like it or
identity,
not,
isn't
that's
it?
the way it
It's
is.
How quaint you
That
are.
is also, even
Times
if you
they are
don't eat.
changing, Ray.
Yeah.
We haven't got time
Yes,
to
you have.
cook and eat anymore.
I think one talking about cutting out the middleman, I think one thing that's really interesting with all the digital technology and new supply chains and things like that, for the first time you've got the small guys, farmers and
straight to
small
the
guys,
consumer. Yeah.
being able to deal directly with the customer through like online sales, e-commerce,
Yeah.
and being able to sell that experience of the farm. I mean, I think that's going to be a big thing in the future, where you're actually telling the story of, it's an experiential thing, where the foods come from, the great
And
environment.
it's huge, that. And
Telling
we
the
see a
story.
huge difference between our traditional markets like the UK, Japan, and New Zealand itself in the use of this technology to buy food and find out about it,
Yeah.
compared to the Asian markets. They're, you can get direct to consumer now in a way that you just couldn't dream. So we're no longer an ingredient supplier at the mercy of the middle man, never mind the middle cow between the food things, to being able to grasp those premiums for ourselves.
And you're seeing more and more of this around the country.
We're seeing the demand and the use of that in particularly China, but also India and Indonesia, growing. So we are trying to get the message out to the New Zealand producers, here guys, don't feel disempowered anymore, you've not got to wait for that one, get out there and get your products direct into market.
And these are to rich people, right?
They're to the middle
Small-
class up.
That can-
Yep.
People
Yeah,
that
but
can
you know,
pay for our products. Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
You
no,
talk-
it's huge.
Yeah, absolutely huge. And they haven't got the infrastructure that the old countries have of the supermarket trolley. No, they want the food delivered direct to their door. One of my favourite pictures that used to have the wow factor, South Korean subway. There's a billboard there. You click on it. There's pictures of the food. You click on it, delivered to your house in 15 minutes.
Yeah.
The virtual supermarkets, and they're growing around the world.
Yeah.
So why hasn't New Zealand got one in every major Asian city?
I don't know. Why
Well, we've got to
hasn't
start it. That's what you're doing tomorrow.
it? You were telling me how you're going to see your beef farmer in Taupo
Yeah.
soon. Tell me about that, because that
So-
seems illustrative.
So what we're doing in the research, we're obviously in market, as Kim has said, looking at what the consumers' values were in which countries and what kind of attributes do they value, including environmental, social, GM-free and that. And then I said, well, we're also looking about how we can cascade that value back down to make sure the producers got benefits from it. And one of our case studies is Mike Barton in Taupo. Now, as you all know, Taupo had a nitrate cap put on it, which effectively meant they had to cut the stocking rates because of the nitrate leaching into the lake. And so Mike Barton has successfully developed a value chain looking at extracting extra value from that product because it's produced in an environmentally sensitive way, particularly reducing water pollution. And very effective marketing in Auckland, Wellington, and they're now into Japan and expanding obviously beyond just their cachet of farms. So that's one example.
Yeah, interesting. Let me talk about the future of dairy for a moment. Dairy's got a very bad name in New Zealand. It's not sustainable. And the number of cows needs to be cut. Anybody argue with that?
Nope. We sat and watched Canterbury become rather polluted.
As a consequence of the dairy.
Yeah. The
And
conversion.
there's no doubt about that.
No.
And it's because of the money. They're chasing the money, right?
I think if we'd have had a better culture about this value proposition, they wouldn't have been chasing the money. But unfortunately, it was one which was a bit more profitable than beef and sheep at the time, dryland farming.
Right. So how will the future of our dairy industry look? Will people be forced to reduce the number of cows? Will the market condemn it for being unsustainable and thereby the price will fall
Well, I think
still further?
the social licence to operate has been the first to really bite that, and the nitrate limits that have been put in around Canterbury and other regions in the country will be the first to change the way the dairy is farmed.
And reduce the number of cows?
Yes, I mean, whether we like it or not, people are looking at other systems, such as feed pads, such as getting them off the land, you know, so
But then they won't be,
pasture raised,
Pasture
happy,
fed,
yep,
yeah.
happy cows.
oh, happy. I mean, you know, come on. All this stuff about how natural milk and it's charming and lovely, you get a whole lot of cows, you impregnate them, then you take their babies away from them and then you steal their milk. You know, we've just changed that story into something that sounds like happy, frolicking bovines in
Well, that's the
pastures.
California one. They marketed on the happy cows.
Well, but nevertheless,
I think you need to be careful not to shoot yourself, though. I mean, you know, having kind of getting involved with many food systems globally, I think the New Zealand dairy business is still held up as a model in terms of innovation. You know, when we had the issue, when we have an issue like with food safety, you know, it affects your GDP. It's a massive business for New Zealand. So, you know, I think any transition there really needs to be, maybe it's about producing protein. Maybe it's about innovation to really get the sustainability piece right. But it's a massively important business for New Zealand. I mean, there's no doubt about that. You know, in Australia, I tell you, we have huge battles around, it used to be about automobiles. Is that our industry? Is it mining, minerals? You know, and then we argue around the importance of food and food security and all of that it brings. Here in New Zealand, there's no question that this is really a fantastic industry for you guys and hugely
make it
important.
right.
Well, you've got to look at making it right then. I mean, if that's an issue that's emerging as a social license, then there's a lot of work going on to either put that right or to look at alternative farming systems. But without a doubt, it's a massive, important business for this country. I mean, I don't think you can argue with that.
We just
No, and I wouldn't argue with that at all, but I think we could do better from it. We could get better premiums and we could get out of supply chains into value chains. And I think I'm probably more familiar with the Canterbury Plain issue rather than, like what's going on in the rest of New Zealand. But there is a real mix there. The nitrate limits are going to stop dairy in some areas. There's no doubt about that. And then we will be going to almond milk factories. I don't know. But we're going to be seeing some of the going back to arable or, other uses that will have more controlled nitrate leaching from them. So, yeah.
We just have to be so careful not to shoot ourselves in the foot, We're relying so heavily for food and all, a whole tourism, a whole range of industries on that clean green image. And if we don't deliver, we we're in big trouble.
I'm thinking about the market forces, right? If there are limits put on the nitrates and that will force farmers to cut down on the cows, might it also force somebody to come up with a solution, a real solution to the leaching of the nitrates and the phosphates?
Well, and they are doing it. There's a lot of research going on in this space, and that's, say, one is to take the cows off the paddocks, and that's the Dutch and the Danes solution, is the cattle's are zero grazed. But we found in market there's not so much of a premium for that as pasture raised. So, if we can get in that pasture raised niche, it's better than grass fed. But there's also a lot of research going on precision irrigation, looking at groundwater zones, so there is a lot of work going on trying to see how they can get around some of this.
There is a basic objection, though, to dairy farming in that it is inherently cruel. It's inherently cruel to do that to a sensate animal. Is that not going to increase in terms of consumer perception over time?
I mean, I agree. I think there's some real vulnerabilities there, and I think the bobby calf thing was horrific. And I think, there are some people trying to produce milk with that niche where the calves are left with their mothers. It's very difficult. It's not, it's certainly not.
Well, someone who recently
elsewhere.
tried to do that has just gone out of business, so good luck.
I think that's for slightly different reasons.
Okay.
Yeah.
But nevertheless.
Yeah, no, it's not easy. Nobody's saying that because you're changing a culture and you're changing, how much are people willing to pay, knowing that the bobby calves are left with their mummies.
Because there's some kind of contradiction, right? If we're aiming for the rich, not necessarily intelligent, but sometimes they are intelligent people, they may well want to buy very expensive food, but they're also going to care about the provenance of it. They're going to care about whether we cared about it. And that would be great to be branding on.
Yeah.
We can't do it right now, can we?
So maybe we produce less and charge more for it.
Yeah.
And instead of turning it all into milk powder and competing in the world commodities market, which seems crazy to me, we, I don't know, turn it into some fabulous little cheese and we market it really well.
And yet we heard today there's a premium on milk powder from New Zealand over competitors. So already, even though that's a kind of commodity in itself, you're still commanding a higher price because you're selling this environment. You've got to get that right. I'm with you. You've got to you've got to try and make sure that you can still sell that story. But I mean, it's a great story. We heard some of the presentations today in the meeting from PhDs from China telling the story around consumer issues around, I think you were chairing the session, weren't you? I mean, around consumer issues around pollution in the environment and really the, selling that clean and green environment.
And the technologies are there now to tell those stories. And, we've spoken to people in China and they do. They want to know the farmer. They want to see the cow using video technologies actually frolicking in the fields.
Wow. So we could just have a generic movie and just send it out there.
Which is...
The cow's name is Jemima. Yeah,
which is part of the whole sort of story of what we want to sell, which is twice the price, there's not much of it, and you better be in.
Yeah.
Isn't that how we want it to be?
Yeah.
It's kind of like that now. It's not that far from here now.
We can tell the story better. We can
tell the story
and we can capture the value from it.
But I think the issue is that the consumer's going to be already demanding much more about information, transparency about food. We call it kind of credentialing, and that's increasingly that's going to be through digital systems. You click on the QR code, up pops all of the information through the supply chain, absolute provenance, but it could be nutritional information, environmental footprint. All of those things are becoming more and more important for the discerning. I call it the middle class instead of the rich, incidentally.
But the menus will just get longer and longer, right?
Well, no, because you've just got that little QR code you click on the side of your mobile phone.
Up pops your farmer and tells the story.
You've got to actually be really squeaky clean about it too, because with the internet and things like that, of course, you've got to find out what other people are saying about you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we should get onto it.
Well, and the trouble with building a reputation as being, 100% pure and squeaky clean and all that is not going to be busted so easily. And once it's busted in today's world, it's really broken. You don't really get your reputation back. That's what worries me. about how we've gone hell for leather into the dairy and the meat industry. And particularly the dairy. We're putting everything into it. And I just get nervous.
I think there's some great opportunities in horticulture. There's an awful lot of activity. I mean, seafood and horticulture, but I think horticulture, particularly the health trends around, vegetables and fruit, real food, Ray. So don't worry about it. Yeah. I think there's a lot of great opportunity in horticulture for New Zealand.
But we need to have something that we can grow better than anybody else. Because I know, Caroline, you've done your work on the food miles, and you've proven that things that are grown here and shipped to Britain are often have a smaller carbon footprint, in fact, than the things that are grown there, but nevertheless, perception is all right. Yeah. So we need to have something that nobody else is producing.
No, we don't.
Don't we? Why?
No, because what we need to have is we can produce the same stuff, but it's not what we're producing necessarily, it's the way we're doing it that will attract people, I think.
Well,
because we don't produce anything that's completely different, do we? No.
But you've mentioned the horticultural industry, and that's a real exemplar in New Zealand. I've talked about Zespri and the new cultivars and coming on and thinking about that. You're thinking of the apples, all the different the varieties, really market-focused, really value-focused, and different consumer segments for those kind of ones. So there are exemplar industries. To say we've put everything in dairy, I think we're stepping back from that a little bit. And I think we've got to realise that it has the potential and has done our reputation not so good in some places. But, people don't expect you to be perfect, but they expect you to have a message about how you're improving. So, to put your head in the sand and say there's no problem, nah. You've got to say, we understand our rivers, they're getting more nitrates in. This is what we're doing about it. We're on a journey to improve those kind of things.
I suggest to you that dairy's done our reputation a great deal of bad, a great deal of harm. In terms of the pollution, in terms of the welfare issues,
pockets where,
all that.
Yeah.
I think that it's undermined the branding that we gave ourselves.
So why are people prepared to pay more for New Zealand milk powder then? If it's so bad.
I think there's two things here.
Because it's not niche marketing, is it?
Well, I think there's two things. Where it's done us harm is probably more in the European type segments of the market, where they see the Guardian reports, they read that one. Those kind of things. When you're looking at some of the Asian markets, they're less probably worried about, they see the clean green, but they see our water quality is not bad because it hasn't got heavy metals in it. It hasn't got those other kind of heavy pollutants. They love our air quality, something we don't celebrate, because their food is produced in air quality we can't even imagine. So, there's still a good reputation in those kind of markets for those kind of reasons. But that's not me saying put your head in the sand and ignore the fact that not everything is perfect.
The sustainability issue is the real one, though, isn't it? And people get mixed messages about that. I mean, okay, New Zealand's committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. New Zealand agriculture accounts for nearly half of our total emissions, and dairy is nearly half of that. It's one of the highest agriculture emission contributions in the world. At the same time, we are told that we are very sustainable. According to Sarah McLaren of the Institute of Agriculture and Environment at Massey, New Zealand farmers produce some of the most environmentally sustainable meat and dairy produce in the world. Can they both be true, those statements?
Well, because they're statements about different things. So one's a bit like the food miles, saying, we can produce lamb at a lower footprint than other countries, but because our economy is so dependent on agriculture, we've got one of the highest greenhouse gas profiles in the world from our agricultural sector, because we don't have that many people, to be honest.
Yeah.
So it's coming from animals.
But again, there's a lot of work. There's a lot of work. I wouldn't kind of rule out that there'll be techniques to reduce that. Significantly reduce methane reduction in ruminants.
We've said the government, Federated Farmers and those guys have agreed to a zero carbon bill.
Yeah.
So we are, at last, agriculture has woken up to that journey. And when we looked, we did some analysis on that, about the implication of an ETS all those years ago on the agriculture here. We found that we could position ourselves in market as the first country to account for greenhouse gas emissions and earn a premium. So why not take leadership?
What are some of the measures that you're thinking of?
There's several approaches. I mean, but it's basically changing the feeding regime. Having a higher energy feeding regime, changing technologies to change the bacteria that are in the rumen, and you can drastically reduce methane. I mean, it's still in the labs and in smaller scale at the moment, but I think those technologies are going to come, and I think they'll command a premium in terms of carbon, reduced carbon meat, meat with a reduced carbon footprint, etc. Yeah.
The interesting thing we never talk about, and this is a bit like your food mile argument, our per capita emissions, on account of the agriculture, our per capita emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, are 1.5 times the global average. So that's pretty high. But I know what you're going to say.
Well, I'm going to say two things there. One is that we're not very good in our urban environments compared to other countries about our emissions.
I wasn't
So
thinking
with the-
you were going to say that.
No, I knew you didn't think I was going to say that. I thought I'd surprise you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to say that it's on account of our high agricultural production, and if the milk produced by countries we send it to
Yeah, okay, yeah.
were to,
Yeah,
they
that
would have a
100%
higher...
then the net around the world would drop.
So we're saving the world, essentially,
Absolutely. I
by
just think it's brilliant.
producing all that milk.
Yeah, no,
but
I
I mean,
think Netherlands.
that's true, isn't it? It's you can judge yourselves as an island or two, and then you can judge yourselves in the global environment, and you get quite a different story.
But I think each country is going to be made responsible for its own. It's not going to be that world argument, and we can ride behind that in a little bit, particularly in the marketing side.
Yeah,
But
eventually.
we're committed to a zero carbon.
Eventually,
so
we
go
will
for
get
it.
caught out. I was just looking at what the head of Landcorp was saying the other day. He surprised me, actually, because Landcorp, I mean, it's going organic, and it's doing a lot of very forward-thinking things. Steve Carden, he said, if the technology exists to produce animal-free burger patties, which we were talking about before, we should be thinking how we can produce specific plant cultivars that are perfect for those, but hard to grow elsewhere. In other words, don't screw your nose up, because we should diversify, we should cover ourselves just in case it takes off. What do you think?
Well, I don't think that we've got necessarily the advantages of growing those cultivars better than anywhere else. So I don't think it's that the reason. But I mean, there are moves on the Canterbury Plains to grow some of these alternative proteins. So we're not totally putting our heads in the sand. But the scale that's needed for that is not New Zealand. Australia, maybe.
But I think there's an opportunity for much more mixed cropping.
Yeah,
that's
that's
I mean,
happening.
what do you
Yeah.
need to grow protein? Well, you need nitrogen.
Yeah.
So I think that's what we've got to try and work out. How do we capture that nitrogen?
Yeah.
And in the right crops, very high protein crops. There's a lot of work because it's not simple. I mean, plant protein. There's a lot of flavour aspects. You get that kind of beanie flavour. So there's a lot of interest in how could you actually...
You're saying it's a bad beanie flavour?
Yeah, some of the products that you eat from plant proteins, you kind of get that. If you're used to that and you've grown up with it, it's fine. But if you're eating it in something that you're not expecting it, that kind of beanie flavour is can be quite off-putting. So there's a lot of interest in getting, trying to think about how you design the right plant proteins. From a flavour standpoint, from a nutritional standpoint, digestibility, all of that sort of stuff. There's a lot of interest. And then what would be the right crop for Australia or New Zealand to go into that space? That's something we're kind of looking at the moment, to be honest. Yeah.
So you're quite advanced on it in Australia?
No, I think actually we're less. I think we're behind many parts of the world. But I think we've just did a big market insights thing in Singapore for the ASEAN region. Yeah. And that was one of the topics we kind of did a lot of interviews around. And there's a lot of activity globally in plant proteins. Yeah. I think the trick will be for us is, how do we get the differentiation? What's the equivalent of our value adding, our differentiation in that plant protein space? So that's what we need to be looking at. We need to, I think we're kind of behind in scale up and commercialization in some systems. But how might we think ahead and try and design that protein so that it will be more marketable and carry a higher margin and stuff, yeah.
I just want to quote Michael Pollan, because I love quoting Michael I think he said this in The Omnivore's Dilemma. And he said, how and what we eat determines to a great extent the use we make of the world and what is to become of it. And it's, you know, it's an existential issue, right? It's not just we're thinking about whether we're going to have beans or chops for dinner. It's really what matters.
It's hugely important. If you look at places traditionally in China, to grow rice, you need absolute social cohesion. And if that gets messed up, because you've got to move water around and all sorts of things, so everybody's got to be working towards it. If that gets messed up, you could starve before you could get it right again. So yes, you're quite right.
Yeah. The other things we haven't really talked about are vertical farms. Have you been talking about those yourselves?
Yeah, no, I love it. I mean, and I love the idea of a vertical farm. I remember I'm very fortunate that a bunch of American students come through and have a lecture each year. And they were passionate about vertical farming and saying, we're going to feed the world from these vertical farmers. We're going to feed, we're going to... And I said, well, what about Singapore? And they said, what's Singapore? So, I mean, they're great, but you actually look at sometimes the carbon profile of those. They're
Just
quite
explain.
high.
The idea is to save space and do it in urban
so they're very
areas.
good for very high-value horticultural. There's two ways you look at them. There's the vertical farming that you're seeing in cities. They're great for high-value horticultural crops that have got a very fast turnover.
Like microgreens.
Lettuce. Yeah, microgreens, you've got it, and things like that. And then there's the vertical farming, which these were more talking about, is that on these skyscrapers, you have your farm, you grow plants on the side of the building and all this kind of thing, which I think is fabulous. I think it's wonderful. It's like local foods. I think it's brilliant. Anything that connects people to their food is great, but that is not what's going to feed the world or necessarily a city.
No.
Yeah.
But having said that, so I've seen the operations in Singapore, and I think they're marginally commercial. I mean, I'm not sure whether they're making a buck. Some of those.
Yeah. No.
You know the ones I mean. But I think the whole think of where we've gone with ag tech and automation. We're doing a lot of protected cropping. We've got automated greenhouse. We've got solar powered greenhouse. Completely contained energy systems. I think the interesting thing is what can you do in terms of growing crops in those systems that so typically a lot of what we've done to grow crops we've kind of we've had to grow them to maximize the yield and because of the stresses that come. If you put a crop in a completely stress-free so no abiotic stress, all of a sudden you could then start to have crops which are optimized for nutrition and other things. So it's kind of opening up new thoughts around what that can bring.
And in the face of climate change, I mean, these are controlled environments, aren't they? And, they're not weather dependent and, there's some real advantages.
I thought that plants needed stress in order to produce things that were good for us.
That's humans.
Isn't that wine?
There are some cases.
I thought it was humans. Yeah.
So there are some examples. So in brassicas, broccoli. I mentioned to you about the broccoli earlier on. In broccoli, that is a response to stress. So the chemical that is good for us, the sulforaphane, which is really looking very good for an anti-diabetic. That's for all sorts of reasons. That is triggered by the plant in response to stress, and we think it's tied with insect resistance and things like that. Yeah. So there are some examples, but you could always induce a bit of stress to make sure you optimise that.
Yeah.
But the thing is, you're not against the elements. It's not your prime driver. You could actually start now to design the system for optimum nutrition instead of maintaining stress.
The future of food then is about turning one thing into something completely different, because you just reminded me about your broccoli lattes. Was it your broccoli lattes?
Broccoli latte, yeah.
Tell me about that.
So we had
because this ties into your concern about waste food.
Well, we have a program where we've been working with horticulture innovation in Australia to try and capture some of the value from the vegetables that get rejected by the retailers. Sometimes there's oversupply on the farm and there's a lot of waste. We talked about consumer waste, but there's a lot of waste through the chain. We call it losses through the chain. Very often, it just gets ploughed back in. Huge waste because you've spent all the inputs, the fertiliser, everything. So we have a program.
And it gets ploughed back in because it's not worth.
It's not pretty. It's not pretty.
Right.
It's not pretty. Not pretty enough for the retailers.
Ugly food.
So we said let's try and capture that. So we had a program to, and in the broccoli case, we made broccoli powder, which is a concentrated 1 to 10 concentrate. So a few grams of this is a serve of broccoli. And then we just had a quirky idea. It was John Lloyd's idea for Hort Innovation to put it, to do a broccoli latte. We went to a cafe in Melbourne, and it actually went viral. I mean, it was in Washington. It was in the BBC and Washington. 15 million hits. So you never know with food. I mean, people.
Well, it's a good
like you
story,
said, people
isn't it?
are really interested in food.
But everybody's it's the universal language.
Even a quirky thing like that, it was tremendous interest. And but that what it gives you is think of that in putting that into a whole snack for kids in a convenient form, and it's only broccoli. Obviously we want them to eat the fresh stuff.
Well, we? But that's the trick. I mean, Ray and I were quoting Michael Pollan at each other earlier on, and he said the carrot is not just vitamin A, right? It's the whole damn carrot.
Yeah, it's not the vitamin A in the carrot, it's the carrot.
And you can't extract bits from things and expect them to do the same as the original thing. And that's a bit like your broccoli powder, isn't it?
No, it's not. No, it's entirely broccoli. There's nothing added, nothing taken away.
So why don't you market that?
Well, I think that's what we're going to do.
And
Absolutely.
then, we could sprinkle it onto the kids'
It's called
chocolate.
Health by Stealth is what it's called.
Health by stealth.
There you
It's
go.
also a cultural thing. Look, we've friends in Italy. We go there. They've got 2 little girls. You never hear this conversation. Eat your broccoli. They eat everything.
Yeah.
It's just nonsense. So I think, what would I know? But isn't it cultural and educational and all that sort of thing a very low-tech solution to, what seems to be a problem?
Yeah, what? You just want to do something really simple like changing the entire culture of New Zealand.
Yeah. Yeah, we
Of
could
the
do
world.
that.
Oh, that one, yeah.
No, I'm sure you couldn't. Futile and naive to try and do things like that, obviously. But you've got to start somewhere.
No, we just saw it as a way of capturing that. It's so annoying for the farmers too. They're losing so much value.
Absolutely.
So this is another value stream for them. Where we're coming from with the food waste, unless you make a business out of it and get some market drivers behind, you're really not going to drive it for public good. You've really got to make a business out of it. So
And that's
can.
where,
Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah.
And that was where you talking about food waste. I was trying to fit it into my concept of the future of food. But that's part of it, isn't it? We have to release our ideas of what we demand in terms of perfection.
Oh, absolutely. In terms of the
Which is
cosmetic
kind of what I was
standards that we
saying
expect
before.
of fruit and vegetables. And some interesting, Countdown you've seen at the moment, they have the ugly fruit and vegetable range and, they're discounted, they're price discounted. There's some debate whether that's a good thing or not. And the opponents to that are suggesting that it's sort of, it's contributing to these, it's devaluing food. It's sort of reinforcing this idea that these are lesser products. They're not nutritionally, they're not any less than their counterparts, their perfect counterparts, but by pricing them at a discount, you're sort of reinforcing those social norms that these aren't perfect products.
Do you think that's
good
a valid
products.
argument?
I think there's some truth to it. I think maybe in the short term, pricing them at a discount makes sense because it's going to get people to engage. But I agree, these products, derived from the waste streams and byproducts are a no-brainer. And I think, we've been doing it, right? We use, industry's been doing this, using byproduct for other purposes for years, but now we can market it. Let's market these as food waste-friendly products. And we've had a 6-year MB program, MB-funded program running in New Zealand looking at the Bioresource Processing Alliance, and that's been looking just, at just this, at getting more value from these.
Actually, we've had a go at the dairy industry, but they've done a very good job at that.
Absolutely.
Many of the, you used to think the whey was the byproduct and the cheese was the product. And that some of the plants, it's the other way around. Actually, the value comes from, the whey and the ingredients off of that. So it's, I think the dairy industry actually has done a very good job at trying to minimise waste. Yep.
But now selling that story, you know.
We've got to tell
These
the story
are food
better.
waste-friendly products.
We've
I
got
think
to-
there's
we've
value
got to
in
tell that
that.
story.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have time for questions from the audience. If there are any, we have a microphone that can be brought to you. Should you want to ask the panel anything about the future of food, or even to respond to what has been said? Any dairy farmers out there? Not saying. Stick your hand up and the microphone will come to you. There it is. Thank you. Oh, he's making you come to it. That's harsh, isn't it?
Hi, I'm a PhD student, and I don't work with bovine milk, but I do work with non-bovine milk. So I have this question to panel: all the concerns that we have with dairy industry, like, does that also applies to the new goat milk, sheep milk, deer milk, buffalo milk, these all sorts of milk? So, or it's like something like alternative dairy that may be beneficial? This all sustainability question, will that applies to these milk industry as well?
I'm not sure we got the question.
Like the sustainability issues that we are talking with dairy industry,
Yes.
will that apply to the alternative bovine milk industry as well, which is now growing within New Zealand?
The alternative what industry?
So
The
not other
non-bovine
types of
milk.
milk, so
Yeah.
camel, goat, all
Yes.
sorts of things.
Yes.
I think if I may,
Yes.
I think the difference, I think, is that many of those industries are kind of quite niche,
Yep.
so they're already kind of higher value, differentiated. I think lots of the issues that we're talking about is the intensification and the volume of the dairy milk. So I think it'd be interesting. I think some of those issues may still apply to those other non-bovine milks. Is that your area of study, non-bovine milks? Yeah. So I mean, but I think you're already kind of smaller scale and kind of niche, and perhaps able to have a different story and a different value proposition in terms of differentiation to bovine milk. Yeah.
What is it that makes those other milks better or more valued than bovine milk? Is it that they have less lactose?
No, it's like they are different in composition. Some are higher in fat and protein, which makes them very good for cheese. So they are very commercially valuable. So like sheep milk and like deer milk, they can produce very good quality cheeses. So in terms of, New Zealand, so it is considered that New Zealand may place it in that direction to produce some high value products from them. As well as like goat milk, which is getting into infant nutrition.
Yeah.
So my concern was like, as these industries are increasing, so like they will be growing, so will their impact will be like similar to what we see in case of bovine milk?
Yeah.
That's the thing.
I
Thank
think
you.
ultimately maybe. I mean, sheep milk's quite a big volume, so some of the same issues that we've talked about for bovine milk would still be the same for sheep milk, I think. Yeah.
And the more diversity we can get, I mean, it feeds into the whole culinary tourism thing, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That the more interesting we can make our regions, and God knows the regions need a bit of a boost right now.
It's also, I mean, you've got to have a really good product as well as the story. I mean, as they say, the proof is in the pudding. It's food, you've got to eat it. You know?
Yeah.
So it does actually have to be really good, too. And we've got lots of good stuff.
Anybody else?
Yeah, it's somewhat tongue-in-cheek, I think, Kim. I did work in the dairy industry all my working life, so I'm very biased. Just to declare my interest, because everybody else here in the room knows it. But I would just make the proposition that the dairy industry is making a huge value add. Milk as it comes from the cow lasts maybe a week. And yet we're selling it all around the world, all year round, every day of the year. And very much tongue-in-cheek, we could halve our emissions per head by rapidly increasing the number of immigrants that we bring into New Zealand.
No, I do. I take your point. Well made. Tell me this, I'll ask you, because I didn't know. In order to get the milk more uniform, you add, is it permeate you add to it? Yes, give him back that microphone.
You're asking the wrong person.
Why?
Yes, permeate is added to milk, but it's added to milk to adjust its composition. One of the advantages that New Zealand has over the rest of the world is that it has a very high protein content. And so by taking the lactose that would be at one time wasted in the whey and putting it back into the milk, we are making our milk similar to other people's in terms of composition.
Well, that's a good explanation, thank you very much. But also leads on to my next question, which is why are we making our milk the same as everybody else's? And wouldn't it be great if there was more of a market for raw milk in New Zealand where we could indeed,
Wrong audience.
where we could indeed make much more interesting cheeses.
Well, you want to answer that?
I just want to make a small comment. I don't know if you've ever looked at the back of a cow, but you'll find that the place where the poos come out is actually immediately above where you put the cups on that you take the milk off.
Oh, you're going to rabbit on about E. coli or something now, aren't you?
Well, you want to have raw milk. And I'm not so... E. coli is a problem, as is Campylobacter, as is Listeria, as is Salmonella, as is a whole lot of other things that get washed onto those teats when it's raining.
No, I do. I understand that. But why isn't the entire population of France sick?
Because all the bad cheesemakers are dead.
You know, there are plenty of European countries, including France, that don't demand that milk is pasteurised, and they seem to be in fairly fine fettle. What?
But the answer is survival of the fittest, as Ray's just pointed out. But I'm not sure that the French drink a lot of raw milk. They eat a lot of raw milk cheeses. And those cheeses are made in a way that they're not fresh. And any of the bacteria that my colleagues just talked about die off.
Right. Okay, you might be right. I don't know. Can anybody enlighten us as to whether the French drink raw milk? Yes, hands are up. Whether French drink raw milk, or you don't drink raw milk, you just make cheese out of it. Ah.
Yeah.
No, give her the microphone. It's the horse's mouth. If you'll excuse the expression.
The French
La
is
bouche de cheval.
No, we drink UHT milk, actually. We don't drink milk like we find in the fridge, like we find in New Zealand. So.
You don't drink milk at all?
No, we do but the UHT one, the ultra heated treated.
Right.
Treated
Yeah.
But,
Because of the health issue.
Yeah, I think it's even like a taste preference. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All
We
right.
don't. You can't even. I think you would really struggle to find raw milk in the supermarket in France, and it's actually in the warm shelf and not actually in the fridge.
There are some vending machines that you can find outside
Next to the farms,
supermarkets
but,
sometimes, and you take your own bottle and you get your raw milk, and so there is.
Well, I was brought up on raw milk.
But
No problem.
You're still alive.
I'm still alive.
And raw milk doesn't necessarily make the best cheese.
Yeah.
You know, I used to be a cheese judge, so...
Yeah. No, but the process of making the cheese with the raw milk thereby makes it innocuous and kills off the bad bugs.
It can do.
Are we allowed to make and sell cheese in this country made out of raw milk?
Yeah, we can buy,
That's all right
Parmesan is
now?
made with raw milk.
Are we allowed to export it?
Very hard cheese, then.
No. Right. Good. All right. Does that mean I have to stop now? Okay. I don't know why that means I have to stop. Why does that? Why is that the signal for the stoppage? Tea.
Tea for
Tea
time.
time.
Normally means toilet time.
You can have one more question if there is one burning in you. A statement? No? Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for the panel. Cheers.
Thank you.